In today's video, we are talking about black serial killers.
Dun dun dun.
So the reason I'm talking about black serial killers today is a few weeks ago on the Joe Rogan podcast, he had Darrell Davis on as a guest. And if you don't know who Darrell Davis is, he's the African American gentleman who was able to convince over 200 former Ku Klux Klan members to leave their organization. A really incredible guy. It's a great interview. So if you haven't seen that, it's on the Joe Rogan podcast, number 1419, Darrell Davis. And one of the questions that Joe had asked him, if my memory serves me correctly, is he asked Darrell Davis, who was the toughest nut to crack with all these guys that he was helping to convert. And he told a story about this one gentleman who believed that all black men had a latent gene in them that made them predisposed to commit crimes. It's a pretty ridiculous thought process, but that's what the guy believed. And so Darrell Davis used some pretty funky pretzel logic on him, where he said to this fella, like, how come all the serial killers are all white guys? Can you name me 3 black serial killers? So that stumped this fella, and then Darrell had said to him, well, maybe there's a latent gene in all white people that makes them all serial killers. And that guy had said, well, I'm not a serial killer. And he says, yeah, but that gene is probably latent in you. So I thought that was really amusing. And the reason I decided to do a little bit of research on it is because I'm a little bit of a true crime buff. And when he said that, I was like, there's actually quite a few black serial killers, but for whatever reason, they just don't gain the notoriety that a Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, the Unabomber, those guys, they almost become like legends in folklore. And for whatever reason, any black serial killers, they just don't register with the national public. So I did a very quick search. What is the percentage of white serial killers? And I was surprised because I actually did, for the most part, believe what Darrell Davis was saying, that the majority are white. But actually, the very first result that turned up said it's 52.1% are white. And then it said the percentage of African American serial killers was 40.3%. So I didn't realize it was that high. I thought it was around, I don't know, maybe like 17%. So that was a crazy high number. That it's coming from Wikipedia, so you got to take it with a little grain of salt. But that is the first result. And then obviously there's a ton of stories after that about debunking long-held myths about serial killers. And so I'll leave it up to everyone else if they want to do a deeper dive on that. If you were to visit ranker.com, they actually have a list of black serial killers. And I scrolled that list, and I didn't recognize one name on it. And it's pretty crazy how, there could be so many of these guys out there, and their stories just get buried somehow. It's almost like they get caught, and, they end up just going to prison, and that's it. There's no follow-up story. I mean, anyone who's a fan of serial killers, that's kind of a weird word to use, but anyone who's like interested in these people, there's like tons of interviews that you can find on like Edmund Kemper or Ted Bundy. It's like the psychiatrists, they couldn't get enough of them, like just interviewing these guys, and the public just eats it up. I mean, there was just a movie on Netflix recently about Ted Bundy. I think part of the reason that white serial killers gain more notoriety is because there's an increased level of depravity in what they do. We also have to consider the kinds of victims that the serial killer is preying on. Typically, the guys who prey on prostitutes, I mean, unless they have like a huge body count like Green River Killer, you don't really hear too much about them. They just kind of disappear. But when it's a guy like Ted Bundy and he was killing college kids, that's obviously a huge story. A lot of times it really just depends on who the target victim is. In the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, his story obviously is really well known. He was committing his crimes back in, I believe he was caught in 1991. Don't quote me on that, but I believe I vaguely remember hearing that story. Like, a story came out, like, on the news about this guy out in Ohio who, the police had just arrested. They had found all these body parts in his apartment. And then as the story unfolded, you have to keep in mind, this is during a time where gay acceptance was not nearly what it is today. So it was kind of this fringe society. Mainstream America was just fascinated overall that, it was like, there's a gay serial killer? And then he had a pretty big body count. It was around 17, 18 victims. And then just, the vats that he had were decomposing bodies in his apartment. And then the body parts that he had just, like, in his fridge. He just had body parts around. I mean, he had, he had male, like, appendages, if you know what I mean, like in his freezer, like stuff like that. So, that kind of thing obviously propels you into some bizarre, legendary status in American folklore. But there was a guy, I guess you could say almost his contemporary, by the name of Kendall Francois, who was an African-American serial killer. And he killed somewhere between like 8 and 9 women in just a 2-year span. They were all prostitutes. He was very prolific. And these murders were committed between 1996 and 1998, so just a few years after Dahmer. He was not a homosexual killer. He was killing female prostitutes, and this was occurring in Poughkeepsie, New York. What's crazy about this story, in some regards, I think it's almost as crazy, if not crazier than Dahmer, is the fact that he was keeping the bodies in a house that he lived in with his mom, his dad, and his sister. So there were 8 decomposing bodies in crawl spaces, and I believe he had dug out some shallow graves underneath their porch. There's one documentary, I believe. I don't think there's anything else on the guy. There was just this one documentary about the level of squalor that he lived in. And I guess that's how his family didn't notice that, there might be decomposing bodies in their house. You know what would be really funny in kind of an ironic sort of way is if Kendall Francois' dad was employed as a security guard somewhere. And now he's got this on his resume. Son's murdering women and just leaving their bodies in the house, and he just never noticed. Kendall Francois was a really big guy. I think in that documentary they said he was like 6'4" and like 300 pounds. He was not like an athletic, 6'4", 300 pounds. I mean, he was kind of morbidly obese and not known for having very good hygiene. And, he was obviously frequenting prostitutes. When he got caught, he surrendered very quietly, and then he spent out his days in prison. So here's the strange thing. He was born in 1971. He died in 2014. I remember hearing about him years ago, and it wasn't until that Darrell Davis interview that, he was one of the first ones that popped in my mind. I couldn't remember his name, which kind of ties in with this whole thing about, there being a lot more African-American serial killers than people think. We just don't know their names. Their names don't resonate with society for whatever reason. But when I went back and started doing the research on him, I'd come to find that he only lived a few more years after he had been arrested. He got busted in 1998, and he passed away in 2014. And before I realized that he had passed away, just like Edmund Kemper or, Bundy, Dahmer, all those guys, they were, interviewed pretty extensively after they were caught. Obviously, Bundy was put to death. Dahmer was murdered. Kemper's still alive and kicking, and I think he still enjoys his kind of macabre celebrity status. He loves talking about, the issues he had with his mother. And before I realized that Kendall Francois had died, I was like, how come they've never visited this guy in prison and just done some interviews with him? What happened in your youth? Where did your anger towards women come from? And at what point did you decide that it was going to be a good idea to just start letting these bodies pile up in your house? And did your parents or sister ever say anything to you? Did the neighbors say anything to you? Oh, hey, I noticed you were out late last night digging a hole underneath your porch. What was going on with that? I think, maybe in these lower class, low income neighborhoods, people just want to keep their heads down. They don't want to get involved with anything just by chance. They might be rolling something that they don't want the police looking at. I don't know. I'm not, I'm just speculating. But It's just weird to me that, the psychiatrists never, maybe they did, I don't know, I'm sure they did some kind of profile on them, but certainly not to the extent of the more famous serial killers. I was like really interested when I thought the guy was still alive. I was like, oh, maybe there is some documentary out there that I haven't seen on the guy where they just interviewed him in prison and they're like, yeah, what was going on in your head? What were you gonna do when you ran out of space in the house? And then the more macabre thoughts start to sink in. Like, did you ever try like eating one of them? Did you have post-mortem fun with them? Quote unquote. You know what I mean. So anyways, what do you guys think about all this? Do you think that African American serial killers just need better PR? Is there some weird kind of reverse racism going on where they're just not getting the status they deserve? Do you think that the liberal media doesn't want to put the spotlight on any kind of marginalized groups, and so they keep these stories kind of on the down low? I guess in conclusion, all I'm going to say is, I got you, Darrell Davis. I knew that there were more African American serial killers. I was shocked to find out just how many more there are and what percentage they're taking up. In the end, this is one of those things where maybe it's not so bad that you're kind of flying under the radar with this one.